Welcome everyone, and delighted to join you on this, our first webinar for 2021. Glad to see so many of you coming back from having attended some of our webinars last year. For those of you who are new, welcome. We have these sessions on a minimum of a monthly basis, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. At the end of the session, you will be receiving by email a copy of the slide deck. So we'll be providing that to you, and we'll be including some additional information in there for you. So let's get started. I'm Clinton Wingrove. I've spent most of my career passionately exploring how do you bring out the best in people? How do you realize their potential? How do you help them to develop and grow? And there's never been a time probably when that's more important. We're now in a situation where things are extremely uncertain, particularly on a business and an organizational level. So as managers, how do we bring out the best? And of course, we're now at the point where arguably we should have probably already planned, but in most organizations, we are now into the planning phase. And as Benjamin Franklin said, and most of us are aware of things that are going on in America, if you fail to plan, you're actually planning to fail. And what we're seeing now is the organizations which are succeeding most effectively, the organizations which are successfully navigating our turbulent times, are the ones that planned. They're the ones who thought about the what if. They did the risk assessments. They worked with their managers to equip them to cater for the uncertain. And we're seeing that differentiator of sustainably successful organizations is the caliber of its management, and largely it is about that planning. They put in place contingency plans. They thought about what would happen if things went wrong. And one of the things I think all of us are going to learn is that what we're experiencing now might not be the coming to the end of something. This might be the start of a new environment in which we will have to operate. And of course, what we're seeing is that the crisis is bringing out what for many of us is an instinct, it's a reaction, and that is this sense of urgency. And this diagram, some of you will recognize, having been on one of our managing priorities and time workshops or webinars. This is development which helps us to look at where we spend our time. Do we spend our time on things which are low or high urgency, low or high importance? And of course, what COVID has done is thrust us remorselessly into focusing on high urgency, high important issues. The problem is, if we don't invest time thinking about the things which are currently not urgent, the things that are currently not demanding attention, those crises are likely to continue and will stumble from one to another. So it's really important as we start to plan that we think about the planning and we think about how are we going to ensure not only that we are ready, but how are we going to ensure that all of our staff are planning to be ready for what comes next. And of course, many of you will say, well, we don't know what's coming next. Well, if we knew what was coming next, things would be incredibly easy. So let's look at how do we equip, how do we help people to plan when there are so many things which are unpredictable. So what I want to go through is a number of things. Firstly, why does virtual make a difference? I was talking with a manager only last week who said, yes, it's the same old, same old. We got to set smart objectives at the beginning of the year. Every year it's the same. And I said, frankly, this isn't the same. We are now in a different world. We want to look at the importance of sharing the bigger picture. I'm going to go through how the importance of actively engaging with our staff, and in particular, the importance of clarity. We're going to look at the issue of checking understanding and commitment. and how important demonstrating empathy is, and then what next. So that's our journey, that's our roadmap for today. So why does virtual make a difference? If any of you came on the session I ran towards the end of last year, time flies, doesn't it? We ran a session on virtual impact, and we talked about how in the virtual world now we have something called emotional distance. A lot of people say, oh, I've had more contact with my boss now because we have Zoom meetings, Blue Jeans meetings, Teams meetings, whatever platform you're using. And yes, we may have contact, but contact is not the same as connection. We know that progressively we are seeing a deterioration in the level of emotional confidence, in the level of emotional connection. People are feeling more remote. It's not that they're just working remotely. They are actually feeling remote. We're seeing increases in anxiety. Many organizations now are seeing rapid upticks in the level of short-term absence, even for people who are working remotely, working from home. And we know that part of this is because we are losing that person-to-person contact, that connection. There are all sorts of theories about what's driving it, not least of which is that when we connect through video, whilst we can see each other, the quality of the video, the compression of the video, we're losing a lot of the very subtle expressions that we typically pick up, the eye movements, the facial expressions, and so on. We're not being able to read people. Much more importantly, I would say, in terms of pure performance, not to say that the emotional side isn't important, but on a performance side, we're also seeing this loss of cognitive connection. We are missing out on a lot of the informal information. And if you think about your own situation, you'll know you often get a feel for how well you're performing as a result of interactions with people. You also get those casual prods. People say, oh, by the way, Clint, when are you going to get that report to me? Oh, yes, I must do that. Yeah, what means I've forgot to do it. So we're losing a lot of those informal connections, that information, that drip feed from the grapevine, those casual interactions and triggers that cause us to do things. We're not walking past people's desks and seeing things which remind us, oh, I must do that. And we mustn't underestimate how significant that loss of information is. And we know that something like 2/3 of people, when they leave a company, one of the comments they make is, I never really knew how well I was doing. The other most common one is, I never really knew precisely what was expected of me. And that's when they had all of these connections. That's when they had that face-to-face contact. That's when they were in the office, in the factory, in the store, in the back room, whatever their job was. So imagine now how much less information that they're receiving, how much less information is getting to them, and consequently, how much less certain they are, A, about what's expected of them, B, how well they are perceived to be doing, and C, how confident they feel in themselves. Because that loss of emotional connection, that loss of information, tends to lead to a reduction in self-confidence. And when we were talking back end of last year in one of our other webinars, we talked about the importance of what staff want. What they need is 4 things. They're looking to us. They're looking to us as managers to provide 4 things. One is clarity around a variety of things, clarity around what's expected of them. And clearly that's part of what planning's for. Clarity about how well they're doing. If we've got people working remotely, it's far less easy for us to give them that feedback. And if we've been not very good at it in the past, the probability is we're going to be worse at it now. But they're also looking for assurance. Virtually everyone I speak to at the moment who's employed makes some reference to the fact that it's currently. There is a high level of anxiety. People need assurance. Now, we can't always give them assurance of their job, but we can give them assurance about what the company is doing to survive COVID, what the company is doing to get through this, what our plans are, etc. Staff are also looking for recognition. There's a slight tendency, and fortunately I think it's reducing, there has been a slight tendency to say, well, people have got what they wanted. They wanted to work from home. And what people are realizing now actually is that they're missing being with their colleagues. It isn't quite as much fun as they thought. That age-old saying, be careful what you ask for. And what people are looking for is some recognition. They're looking for an acknowledgement that actually the things are not quite as smooth and fun as perhaps was originally anticipated. They want recognition for the fact that they are actually struggling to cope with homeschooling, with working remotely when perhaps them and their partner are trying to share the Wi-Fi, the desk, etc. And people are looking for empathy. We know that one of the strongest drivers of relationships is mutual empathy, the ability to demonstrate that you understand someone else's situation without necessarily feeling the same way. So empathy is about understanding, not necessarily sharing the feeling. So all of these things are impacting. So as we come into 2021, when everyone's nervous, everyone says we can't predict what's going to happen, and yet we've got these really powerful needs from our staff, the people for whom we are responsible. What should we do? The first thing is, let's remember these four criteria, and let's look at those in the context of typical performance management, typical planning processes. What we see here is a model of any performance management process. This is taken from our 7MPC, or our 7-minute performance conversations program, where we share the results of our research into large numbers of performance management processes. And what we discovered is it doesn't matter what your forms look like, what your process is, what technology you use, how often you have feedback reviews, what your rating scales are. Every performance management process has these 7 components. And 2 of them are particularly important, preceding the issue of the planning step. And the first one is setting direction. What we know is all organizations have some overall goal, some overall intention. Yeah, sometimes this is described in the form of a mission statement or vision. Sometimes it's also covered in a strategy. It also encompasses the values. But every organization has this. Many of our staff now are beginning to realize how important that is. If suddenly you're remote, you're not mixing with people every day, you lose that feeling of that culture, that ambience, that sense of what matters. And if you're working in an organization, and any of you who can remember joining the company that you currently work for, you'll remember how those things struck you on your first day and during your first week. And you went home to your partner and said, well, you know, they're really keen on doing things on time, or they really care about their customers, or I didn't realize how important this was to them. So it's really important as a manager that as we move into the planning process, we make sure we share with people what are the priorities, what is the organization really focusing on, how does it see itself getting through the current crisis and issues, and in particular, what, for example, is its strategy. And I'm working with some organizations who are already developing strategies for the new workplace, what it's going to be like if and when we do get through the COVID-19 period. Other organizations are saying, no, our strategy is we're going to batten down and survive it. Other organizations are saying this is our opportunity to cut costs. We're going to rid ourselves of some of our high cost capital assets in terms of property, etc. And we're going to move permanently to remote working. Your staff want to know, what is the goal of the organization now? What are these bigger level priorities? How do the senior executives view things? And how does that affect their role? What is their role? Is their role primarily about addressing the urgent issues with customers? Is their role primarily about helping the organization cut costs? Is their role primarily about helping the organization attract new clients ready for when things change? Is their role primarily about supporting each other, supporting wellness, making sure everybody is well looked after? It's really important as managers, as we move into the planning process, we give people this context that they understand. What are we now trying to achieve? What are the priorities that the organization is committing to? What's our strategy for coping with this? Now, do we know all the answers? Of course not. If we knew all the answers, we wouldn't need a strategy. The reason we need a strategy is it helps us to decide which actions next make sense and which actions next wouldn't. And all of our staff need to understand that. So we need to spend time. We need to share with them what this bigger picture is. And that's really important, going back to our previous model when we were looking at where we spend our time. Planning is about looking at the things that might not be urgent now, but if we don't attend to them, will become urgent. So it's about identifying, for example, if your staff are dealing with customers, what is it we need to do to ensure that our customers stay with us? We might not be able to serve them as well immediately as we could. So we're addressing the emergent, the urgent and important issues. But more importantly, how are we going to retain contact with them so that when the business revives, we can rebuild that? So with each of our staff, we need to be asking them to think, what are the things which, if you had lots of time, you would focus on because it would help us secure our future? Now let's look at which of those we can actually devote time to now, which of them are important enough, because if we don't attend to them, they themselves will then become crises. So really important, big picture, getting people to look ahead. The next thing is it's really important to engage with people. As I mentioned earlier, we know that even with people who are not willing to tell us, that there is a dramatic increase in the level of anxiety, the level of uncertainty, the level of concern. For some people, it's loneliness, and an extreme level, it turns into depression. We should never underestimate the potential level of concern that our staff have. The more concerning that they are, the less likely many of them are to share it with us. It's our role, therefore, during the planning process to actively engage with people. What do I mean by actively engage? I don't mean just ringing them up and saying, how are you? And if you get the answer, I'm fine, that's not necessarily accurate. It's about creating an opportunity for people to speak to. We have to create a psychologically safe environment. So it's about consciously connecting with each individual, giving them time, asking questions, giving them chance to share things with us, giving them an opportunity to talk through how they're handling their time. So not just asking them how they feel, but so how are you coping with what's going on at the moment? What issues are you having to grapple with? Are you having to spend time on other things? And getting them to talk through how they're handling those, because then we can start to read the clues. We can start to understand. But also actively engaging. The vast majority of our staff want to do well. They want to perform well. So also asking them, what do they believe they can achieve? What do they believe they should be spending their time on? One of the most common complaints I get from executives who I coach is people never tell me what's going on. Well, that might be because of how you go about asking or not asking them. So we really do at this beginning, at this start of the year, this year which has got unprecedented uncertainty involved and a major compaction of time scales, it's really important that we ask our staff, what do you believe should be your priorities? I've shared with you what the organization has. What do you believe you should be spending on your time on? Where do you believe your effort should be going? And we need to be aware that performance actually is composed of three things. Performance isn't just about results. Now, are results important? Of course they are. That's why we pay people. We pay people to deliver something of value. That might be a service. It might be a product. It can vary tremendously. So, of course, outputs or results are important. But so is how people go about things, and so is their personal development. And it's really important, therefore, that we talk with our people, we actively engage them in a conversation about what is it we're looking for them to achieve, what are the outputs we want them to produce. And a lot of organizations are saying, well, it's only output that matters. Let's measure output because we can measure output much easier than we can measure input or how. And the answer is, of course you can. But we know from experience, if we focus purely on output, we lead to some really bad behaviors. Focusing on output frequently distracts people from the importance of how they go about doing things. And we need to have conversations with our staff. They were used to working often face-to-face in the working environment where they had access to guidance, help, reference materials, etc., other people. We need to have conversations with them about how do they achieve their results now, given that they're working remotely? How do they connect with people who are permanently on Zoom, Teams, etc. meetings? How do they resolve things with people where they used to go and sit on the corner of the desk and talk to them, and now they've got to try and connect with them in a virtual medium? So as managers, we have an obligation to ensure that each of our staff understand quite clearly, not just what we want them to produce. Of course, that's still important. It's the measure of success. But we also want to make sure that they understand how to work in this new environment, how to go about doing things which they may not have experienced doing remotely before. We also need to be talking to them about growth. What's the skills and knowledge they need to acquire in this new environment? But also for some of them, one of the benefits that they're actually experiencing is the ability to engage in virtual learning. So let's make sure we help them to think through what's the learning, what's the development that would be most appropriate for them? What would give them real added value? So as a manager, think about how are you going to engage? How are you going to have those conversations? How are you going to be talking through with your team each of these things? And the level of detail at each will vary tremendously. Clearly, if you're a senior manager responsible for an entire function, what gets produced is of paramount importance. But if you're perhaps someone who's handling customer complaints, it's much more important how you go about it. Now, is there a what measure? Of course there is. How many calls did you answer in an hour? How many problems did you resolve? But how you did it is going to be fundamentally important. I had a major experience with a very high-end domestic appliance supplier, an inordinately expensive kitchen device that went wrong. And the quality of customer support I had was appalling. And as a consequence, I will never buy from them again. And I've told multiple people who that company is. Any manager in that company needs to be thinking about how their customer support people handle issues, not merely what they do. So have that conversation, because that gives you part of this clarity. And I still believe in the concept of SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. But I find in a lot of organizations, we don't really take that to heart. We should be thinking in terms of defining not just the output results we want in this way. We should also be thinking about how we define the behavior, the how, the processes that people follow. You can also define development in these terms. And the particular one that's of interest now is measurable. It's the one that most of us struggle with. The vast majority of goals and objectives I see which claim to be smart are not very smart at all. They're often stunningly mediocre. And the weakest bit is often the measure. Given that people are working remotely, we need to equip them to know how well they're performing. We need to equip them to measure their success. And timescales are now crushed. Organizations that used to develop 5-year plans are frequently now struggling to plan for the next 2 weeks. Just look at how national governments are struggling with planning for COVID. Well, organizations are the same. And don't believe just because someone has moved from coming into an office in the city to going sitting at home at their desk that the issue is exactly the same. It isn't. Again, how much of the feedback they got about how well they were performing, and feedback is a measure, how much of that was coming to them informally, and how much of that are they now missing? So we need to make sure when we're planning things with our staff to talk about how are you going to know yourself how well you're doing about this? How will you know if you've achieved this? How will you know if you're above standard or not? And this is a thorny issue because very often in organizations, we set a measure and we say, for example, you must sell 5,000 widgets a month. Well, does that mean 5,001 is exemplary performance and 4,999 is unacceptable? And the answer is, of course, no. That would be a nonsense. But what's equally nonsense is we often don't have those conversations with our staff. And it's all the more important now, given that they're working remotely, that staff understand the range over which their performance can span. What would we consider to be exemplary? In other words, if they hit that, they should perhaps then divert their energy and effort onto something else. What would be a minimum, at which point we'd call halt and say, this is a shortfall? So we need to have intelligent conversations with our staff around what's the range of performance we're expecting, because we're expecting them to put down the phone, turn off the webcam, and then operate. Now, I'm putting to side those organizations that are investing in software that monitors their staff performance, monitors whether they're using the keyboard, monitors whether they have their webcam on. I find those types of processes unacceptable, even though I'm a technology geek. So I'm working on the basis that you have intelligent people working for you, where you trust them sufficiently, which you, if you don't, you probably shouldn't have employed them, or you should be doing something about them. So with those people, make sure during the planning process they understand the range of performance for the variety of things they're producing. This enables them then to make intelligent decisions. If I'm close to hitting a target on something and I'm now working out what to do tomorrow, spending my time on something that's currently below standard probably makes most sense. So giving people that level of specificity equips them to make intelligent decisions. It enables them to take advantage of any empowerment we might be giving them. And very often in organizations, we claim to have empowered people, but not given them the clarity around boundaries of what becomes great, what minimum needs, where the priorities are, etc. And then there's the issue in SMART, which is around timescales. You will probably have in your organizations processes that require you to set annual goals. It's not for me to tell you not to do that, but I have a responsibility to say they're probably going to change. Look at what happened last year. I'll be extremely surprised if I found that more than about 10% of people weren't significantly affected by COVID in terms of the results that they were expected to achieve, and more importantly, how they were expected to go about them. So what we need to recognize is that timescales, where we used to think in terms of year, quarters, and months, we probably now need to be talking in terms of hours, days, and weeks. So that means we need to be much clearer with our staff. We need to be talking to them on a frequent basis, planning. What are you going to be doing tomorrow? What are you going to be planning to do next week? Because things are probably going to change, and they're probably going to change at that speed. And that won't necessarily be linked directly to things like lockdown. Those things have ricochet effects. Lockdown will have affected some of your vendors, some of your customers, but you won't experience that effect perhaps for another week. But when it hits you, it'll affect maybe quite short term. So with each of our staff, we need to be thinking in terms of much, much shorter timescales. The concept of waypoints or milestones is now critically important because it gives people that clarity and it gives them that assurance. So planning shouldn't be something that we have a conversation with them now. We set our annual plan and then we review in a quarter. We should be talking to them about a rolling planning process, one where we're constantly retouching, particularly the milestones and the waypoints, reviewing what's practical, what isn't practical. Now, of course, that means we may have a level of complexity we've not been used to before, and that's fine. But what we've got to be careful is that we don't make assumptions. And Alan Greenspan is the one who's most commonly cited for this quote, who said, "I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant." Why is that relevant? The reason that's relevant to the planning process is we are likely to be doing most of our planning remotely. We're likely to be having Zoom, Teams, Blue Jeans, etc. meetings. We may or may not have our webcams on. And we now know that significant amounts of information are lost through communication. We know that our ability to pay attention, our ability to focus is very limited. And consequently, it's very easy to have a conversation with someone and literally seconds later, they articulate something quite different to what we thought we said or we thought they said to us. So it's really important during the planning process that we frequently check. We check to understand what the other person believes they're planning to do, what they're planning to achieve, how they're planning to go about it, the development that they need. And the only way we can do that is through a dialogue. We have to have a conversation. We have to get them to share back with us what they believe they've just committed to. So planning is really important. It's no good us just having a single conversation and then us sending them a summary. We need to check to ensure that in their heads, what they heard, what they believe they've committed to is the same as what we believe. And part of the way of getting them to open up and to be honest with us is to demonstrate empathy. We now know that empathy is a very reciprocal issue. If we demonstrate empathy, if we demonstrate consideration for other people, we now know that that triggers a very strong reciprocal response. And I did some research with Dr. Paul Marciano before we wrote the book Super Teams. And in Super Teams, what we were looking at is what differentiates the teams that consistently excel from the teams that are just good. And what we discovered was in the teams that consistently excel, there's a very high level of respect from the workers to the leadership, and the individual workers all feel on an ongoing basis highly respected. And one of the significant drivers of that was demonstration of consideration or empathy. So really important during your planning conversations with staff, particularly if you're asking them to commit to improving, you're asking them to commit to achieving things that might be quite challenging. It's really important that you demonstrate empathy, that you articulate how well you understand their situation. But even more importantly, you ask them. So again, I talked earlier about the importance of asking people how they feel, asking them what they believe they could achieve, asking them how they would go about things, asking them what development they might need. That's all empathetic. But the most significant one is this one. What can I do to help you meet those expectations? And what we found in our research for super teams was that teams where this was a habit typically did excel. That whenever anyone made an expectation of someone else clear, they asked the question, and what can I do to help you achieve that? You might find some people will tell you, leave me alone and let me get on with it. Don't keep having these meetings. Another person might say, I need you to check in with me, touch base with me on a frequent basis. Each of these are likely to be individual. So the question then is, what do you do next? So you've shared the big picture. You've ensured they understand the priorities. You've told them what the organization's strategy for the coming weeks, months, quarters, and possibly year is. You've asked them what they believe they could focus on. You've then worked with them to define as clearly as possible so they feel comfortable. You've articulated what you want them to achieve. You've had a conversation with them about how they're going to achieve it so you could reassure them that that will be appropriate. And you've talked to them about the development they might need to be able to do that. You've done all of that. You've got that defined specifically in terms of SMART goals. And where there is opportunity for anxiousness, anxiety, or uncertainty, you've clarified ranges of acceptability so that you can leave them empowered to perform. So the question then is, what next? Well, the first thing is get them to confirm. It's really important, in my view, that having had a conversation with someone about what you expect of them, get them to confirm that back to you. Don't send them the confirmation, because if they didn't understand, because they didn't listen, they probably won't read what you send either. What's really important is to discover how well they understood and what commitment there is. So if you ask each of your staff, just drop me an email, send me a text message, explain to me what you believe we've agreed in terms of the performance expectations, the planning, what we want you to work on, how we want you to go about it, and the development you need. You will learn from the level of specificity, the accuracy with which it matches what you believed. You will learn where you need to invest your time. Some of your staff will send you something that is absolutely on the button. Others will send you something which begs the question, were they really listening when you had the conversation? So you get a real zeroing in of where you need to spend your time. Also ensure that monitoring and measuring are in place, and preferably by them. It is increasingly difficult in a virtual world for you as a manager to monitor and measure what people are doing. You may be able to measure the output. So, for example, call center figures, sales figures, invoices paid, things sold, services delivered, whatever your people do. But what is really difficult to monitor and measure is how that's being done and the growth and the development that's taking place for them. And that's something that you need to equip them to do. Equip them to be able to monitor that. Equip them to be able to measure. Equip them with ways of getting feedback in this new environment. Because if they take an active role in monitoring and measuring their own performance, it's far more likely to support their desire to improve. And then make sure you agree a follow-up process. And I've never been a great believer in annual or quarterly processes for improving performance. They're necessary as part of collecting data. They're necessary for doing calibrated assessments and evaluations. But they're not sufficient, in my opinion, for improving performance. In order to ensure that your plan gets implemented, you need to have a follow-up process which is unique to each individual. And you'll be very lucky if all of your staff, no matter how many you have, are all going to respond to the same frequency and style of feedback and response. In a virtual world, we need to adapt. You need to understand which of your staff can you address on a monthly basis? Which of your staff do you need to address on a weekly basis? Which of your staff do you speak to triggered by monitoring performance and results, etc.? And then calendarize them. Make sure that when you are going to have a conversation, calendarize it so that they know it's going to happen. That will trigger them to ensure that they're prepared for the conversation. It becomes part of the plan. We all know that plans are only hopes unless they have this follow-up component. So when we've agreed what they're going to produce, when we've agreed how they're going to produce it, when we've agreed the development they're going to try and achieve during the period, if any, we need to understand what are the waypoints, what are the milestones, when do we touch base on these? Now, we're talking here about planning. That's planned feedback, that's planned monitoring. I also believe that ad hoc, unplanned, unexpected connections and interactions are equally important in terms of driving performance. And we have a program called 7MPC. It's being relaunched at the end of this month, where we talk about how can you dramatically increase people's performance using just 7-minute performance conversations. But that's the follow-up. What I'm talking about here is the formal. When you're planning performance with each of your team, make sure that you plan it with a frequency that's suitable to each individual. So let's go back and summarize. So virtual, why does virtual make a difference? Be aware you've got levels of anxiety, loneliness, emotional disconnect, and cognitive disconnect that are meaning planning is more important now than it ever was. We need to make sure we are connecting with people. We're giving them the clarity and the assurance that they understand how they're going to be judged, what it is we're expecting them to achieve. Secondly, we need to share with people the bigger picture. You may not be able to tell people what the company is going to do about COVID. You may not be able to guarantee them their job for the next 6 months. But what you can do is to share with them the bigger picture. What does the company currently see as its priorities? What's it trying to achieve in the relatively short to medium term? Where does it want them putting their effort and why? As Simon Sinek, who's one of the world's leading experts on the concept of why, will say, if people understand why you want them to do things, They will be able to work out for themselves what to do. And then thirdly, actively engage. Actively engage is not running staff meetings, not running meetings with all 12 of your team on board. Actively engaging is when you connect with them on a one-to-one basis, where you demonstrate empathy, you recognize them uniquely for what they are doing and the circumstances they face. And if you actively engage with people and listen, they will tell you what they can do better. People now want to be certain their job is safe. They will tell you what they can do to improve if you give them the opportunity to do it. And then ensure clarity. Make sure people understand what's expected of them and how to go about it. In many cases, moving from working in the office to working remotely triggers dramatic changes in how you expect them to handle certain situations. Make sure you have those conversations with them so that they can plan their performance accordingly. And what are the growth or development needs that this environment is triggering? Not just to cope with the current situation, but we need to learn from this. We need to equip our staff to handle the unexpected, because it will happen again. We just don't know why and we don't know when, but it will. And then make sure that you check that people understood what you expected of them, how you expected them to go about things, and what development you expected of them. Get them to articulate it back to you. That will tell you both what they understood, and it will also give you a level of indication of their commitment to it. And then lastly, demonstrate empathy. As managers, it's important that we demonstrate to our staff that we understand the situations that they're in. That does not mean that we become weak and soft. It does not mean that we let them get away with things. It means we apply realistic standards. We adapt our expectations of them to acknowledge the circumstances in which they find themselves. And giving them the clarity will ensure that we have their commitment. And then lastly, with the follow-up, it's really important that we follow up, and we follow up appropriately. But in the same way in the office or in the store or in the factory, when we walk around, we would spend more time with some people than others. Equally with the follow-up, we need to attune it to match the individuals. And we need to make sure that they are equipped to follow up as well. How do they know? How can they tell how well they're doing? By giving them that clarity around the what, the how, and the development, and giving them the clarity around the range of performance we expect during this period, we equip them to monitor their own plans. So some quick thoughts there for you on how to plan performance. If any of you want to have a conversation with us, you can book a call using the link that's shown here. We'd be happy to just have a no obligation conversation with you. If you wanted to email us, you can email us at info@clintonhr.com. clintonhr.com is sponsoring this webinar. And we're also offering, for those of you in organizations, a free 3-hour workshop for between 8 and 16 people. If you wanted one, we will be emailing you this slide deck after the event. That will probably go out tomorrow morning, so you'll have that in your inbox by Monday. So thank you all for your attention. As I said, it's great to see some of you back to join us. For those of you who joined us for the first time, we'll be circulating with the slide deck the date and time of our next workshop and the topic. If any of you want to make suggestions, remember, info@clintonhr.com. Please send us your suggestions and we'll be more than happy to consider them. In the meantime, we wish you every success during 2021. Please stay safe, stay well. We will get through this, and we're going to do our best to help you to do that. Thank you, everyone.